Welcome to session 3B. We continue to look at the life and time of the great King David. So the fifth incident that I want us to look at in the life of David. At one time, David is overtaken by anger. He sent his men to a gentleman called Nabal, or rather should I say, to a man called Nabal who was a fool. It's his wife that said that. Now, this man Nabal insults David and sends them back empty-handed. And David is very angry. His anger is kindled greatly. Something that we saw similar to Saul. And so David says, God do so to the enemies of David, and more so if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. And David told his men, take your swords. We are going to finish Nabal's household. Then there was a wise woman called Abigail. She got wind of what was happening, and she quickly rallied her servants and went to meet David, and of course talked him out of that plan to revenge. Which brings me to my fifth question. When overtaken by anger, and we ask this question again with Saul, an anger that is justified because maybe somebody has ruffled, the place, has touched the place that they should not in your life. How do you respond? How do you react? Do you take up arms to revenge? Do you take up arms to prove your point? Or do you stop and seek words of wisdom or listen to words of wisdom? David listened to Abigail. It could have been anybody that would have talked David out of that plan to revenge for himself. But, there's a saying that says, it's only a fool that has not changed their mind. So, David, even though he was angry, and even though he intended to take vengeance to prove his point to this man Nabal, when wisdom came to his doorstep, he stopped, he listened to wisdom. And later, he's actually thankful to Abigail for saving him from shedding blood. Blood that would have worked against his kingship, blood that would have worked against his leadership. So he was wise. Once again, we see a man who exercises wisdom restrained. In another incident, David again is seemingly on the losing end. And he covets. Again, we talked about coveting when we talked about Saul. So he covets the wife of Uriah and actually takes her and plans for him to be killed. And he's actually killed. Now, after that has happened, of course, David feels things are okay. But then the prophet Nathan comes to meet with him and tells him, this is what you have done and it is wrong. David had been overtaken by his covetousness. He had been overtaken by his greed. He had been overtaken by some emotions, that he should not have allowed to go that direction. But when he is confronted with the real issue, David is remorseful. That's what makes the difference between David and Saul. When Saul was confronted with his error because he had allowed his emotions to drive him in the wrong direction, he gave an excuse. When David is confronted and he is told, you have erred, he is actually remorseful and actually repents with so much pain and depth in his heart. He cries out and repents and turns from what he had done. Which brings me to my 6th question. When you find yourself in a compromised state, like David, sometimes we get overtaken by our emotions. And sometimes we end up doing just the wrong thing because, we didn't stop to think, or we didn't stop to get counsel and wisdom. But when you get to a place where you have compromised, how do you respond to correction? How do you respond when you are rebuked? How do you respond when you're criticized? And I mean criticism in a positive way. Do you give excuses like Saul, or do you become remorseful and repentant like David? Emotional intelligence. The 7th area that I want us to see about David. Now, David is having to run from his very own son, Absalom. Absalom wants to take the kingdom by force. And he does what he does, and he comes to the city, Jerusalem. And David, who is king, a mighty warrior, a powerful king, gets to hear about it. And David has a choice to make. He has to choose between his son and his kingdom. He has to choose between his son and his position as king. Of course, he must have been very disappointed that his son was trying to overthrow him when he's still on the throne. That's actually treason. And David would have said, get hold of him, put him in jail. In fact, he would have been hanged for attempting to overthrow the king. But David has to make a very delicate choice between a soul, position, and power. And so David takes a decision. He's not driven by the anger he probably feels. He's not driven by the disappointment he probably feels about Absalom, his son. He's not driven by the disappointment that he feels about his son. He's not driven by the anger. He's not driven by power and position. So he makes a decision to leave the city, Jerusalem, and actually runs from his son. Looks cowardly. But when you really think about it, as far as this conversation of emotional intelligence is concerned, David was a man who again exercised high level of emotional intelligence. Why do I say that? David had to choose between his kingdom, power, and position. Is it his position and power or his son? Which brings me to my 7th question. When you are betrayed by a loved one, when you are betrayed by the people that you lead, and betrayal is painful, and especially if it's by a family member. What would you rather? Preserve your position or preserve the soul of that person, even though they have betrayed you? David seemingly did a cowardly thing. He left Jerusalem. He chose to preserve the life of his son rather than preserve his position and his power. He was not a man that was driven by power and position. For him, life was more important. Emotional intelligence. And by the way, even when his son Absalom was killed, he mourned for his son greatly. Finally, the eighth thing that we look about the life of David. There was an incident at Ziklag. David and his men have come back home, and they find their children, their wives, everything has been taken by the enemy, and their camp has been burnt down. And at that point, David, the great King David, is in distress. That's what we are told. And he's even in such great distress, not just because his wife, his children, and everything that he owned has been taken, but because the men that trusted him had now turned their back on him. They wanted to stone him. They wanted to finish him. The very people that he trusted entrusted him. That was probably one of the lowest point of David, perhaps. Which brings me to my eighth question. When you are in distress, when you are alone because everyone has turned against you, how do you respond? What do you do? Do you lose hope? Do you threaten them? Do you give up? What do you do? David did one very simple thing that turned things around for him. He encouraged himself in the Lord. He chose not to lean on his own strength, but to lean on the strength of God. He inquired of the Lord. He sought wisdom from God. When we are in distress and there is no one to come to our rescue, and the weight of everything that has happened is on you and you're alone, the wisest thing, lean on a higher strength. And that strength is God. Inquire the wisdom of one who is higher than you. And the one that is higher than you is no other but God. Emotional intelligence.